My mom told everyone I was mentally unstable until hospital records exposed her secret. The day Marcus Webb turned 31, he sat alone in a parking garage in Tucson, Arizona, staring at a manila envelope on the passenger seat. Inside that envelope were 64 pages of hospital records. Records that covered 18 years of his life. Records he had never been allowed to see. His hands were shaking, not from fear, not from anxiety, not from whatever diagnosis had been written in his file since he was 9 years old. They were shaking because he already knew, on some level, what was inside. He had known for a long time. That quiet suspicion you carry in the back of your mind the way you carry a stone in your shoe, small enough to ignore, painful enough to never forget. His phone buzzed. His mother. He let it ring. He opened the envelope. And in the fluorescent half-light of that parking garage, on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2019, everything Marcus Webb had been told about himself, every label, every prescription, every year lost to confusion and shame, began to unravel. But to understand what those 64 pages contained, you have to go back. All the way back to 1995. To a house on Willowbrook Drive in a small town in central Ohio where a 9-year-old boy woke up one morning feeling perfectly fine and was told, by the woman who was supposed to protect him, that something was deeply wrong with his mind. What happened next is one of the most quietly devastating stories I have ever come across. And you need to hear all of it. Millbridge, Ohio. Population 8,400. The kind of town where everybody knows your last name, your father's occupation, and what your grandmother used to bring to the church potluck. It was the kind of place that looked like a postcard in October, maple trees burning orange and red along the main street, the smell of wood smoke coming through kitchen windows, the sound of high school football practice drifting over the hill every Thursday evening. A quiet place. A safe place, or so it seemed. The Webb family lived in a beige colonial on Willowbrook Drive, about 1.5 miles from the elementary school. The house had a wraparound porch that Sandra Webb kept immaculate. Flower boxes in the windows. A ceramic rooster by the front door. From the outside, it looked exactly like the kind of home that appears in insurance commercials. Sandra was 41 in 1995. She was the kind of woman who arrived early to school events and stayed late. She organized the church's Christmas toy drive and knew every other parent in the neighborhood by first name. She had a soft voice and a concerned expression that she wore the way other women wore jewelry, always and with intention. People trusted her. People liked her. More importantly, people felt sorry for her. Because Sandra Webb, as she would tell anyone who asked, and quite a few people who didn't, had a very difficult situation at home. Her son, Marcus, was 9 years old that fall. He was a thin, quiet kid with brown eyes that were a little too watchful for his age. He liked dinosaurs and building things out of cardboard and reading encyclopedias at the kitchen table. His third-grade teacher, a woman named Mrs. Patton, would later describe him as one of the most attentive students she had ever taught, curious, careful, never a behavior problem. But that was not the story being told on Willowbrook Drive. The story being told on Willowbrook Drive was that Marcus had episodes, that he would become uncontrollable without warning, that he heard things, imagined things, said disturbing things in the middle of the night, that Sandra was exhausted and heartbroken and doing everything she could for a child whose mind was, in her words, just not right. And because Sandra said it with tears in her eyes, and because she was so clearly dedicated to her son, everyone believed her. What they didn't realize was that the story had started long before any doctor ever saw Marcus. And it had been written entirely by one person. By November of 1995, the version of Marcus that existed in Millbridge's collective memory was already complete. The narrative was set. Neighbors spoke in lowered voices when he passed on the sidewalk. "That's the Webb boy," they'd say, not unkindly, but with that particular combination of pity and distance that people reserve for things they don't understand and don't want to get close to. His classmates weren't cruel, not openly, but they knew enough to keep space between themselves and Marcus. Children are extraordinary sensors. They can detect a warning from adults even when it's never stated directly. His uncle, Sandra's brother, pulled Sandra aside at Thanksgiving that year and told her maybe she needed to get a second opinion. Sandra cried. She said no one understood what she was going through. She said Marcus had had an episode just that morning, and she was terrified to leave him alone. The uncle backed down, the way people always back down with Sandra. She had a talent for making concern for her son look like an attack on herself. The pediatrician, Dr. Alan Morse, had been Marcus's doctor since birth. He was a cautious man, thorough, and he didn't rush diagnoses. But Sandra came to his office 8 times between January and October of 1995. 8 times, with detailed written notes about Marcus's behavior, times, dates, descriptions of what he had said or done. She brought the notes in a little binder.
She was organized.
She was prepared. She was, by every observable measure, a mother fighting for her child. Dr. Morse referred them to a child psychiatrist named Dr. Helen Ferris in Columbus. The appointment was in December. Marcus remembers that drive. He remembers sitting in the back seat looking out at the gray Ohio highway and asking his mother where they were going, and she said they were going to see a doctor who was going to help him. He asked what was wrong with him. She reached back and patted his knee and said, "Nothing that we can't manage, sweetheart." He was 9 years old. He believed her completely. What none of the doctors knew, what no one in Millbridge knew, was that Sandra had been preparing for this appointment for weeks. She had rehearsed. She had a story, and she had been telling it long enough that she believed it herself. And that is perhaps the most chilling part of all of this. The performance was so practiced, so consistent, so layered with genuine seeming emotion that no one ever thought to look for the seams. Marcus Webb, as a child, was not what the story made him out to be.
He was quiet, yes. He was serious for his age.
He had the kind of interior life that made adults slightly uncomfortable because you couldn't always tell what he was thinking, and most adults, when they can't tell what a child is thinking, assume the worst. He wasn't social in the way that earns you easy popularity. He didn't chase or shout or perform.
He observed.
He cataloged. He remembered things. He remembered the exact date his father left, for instance. March 3rd, 1991. He was 5 years old. His father, Robert Webb, was a civil engineer who had moved to Pittsburgh for work and, over the course of 2 years, had simply stopped coming back. There were phone calls for a while, birthday cards, then less of that, then nothing. Marcus had a single photograph of his father, taken at a state park in 1990, which he kept inside his encyclopedia of prehistoric life, between pages about the Cretaceous period and the extinction event. He didn't talk about his father. Not because it hurt him to talk about it, although it did, but because he had learned very early that certain subjects upset his mother in ways that were unpredictable and that it was safer to stay quiet. That was the other thing about Marcus. He had learned to read the room at an age when most children are still learning to read sentences. He knew Sandra's moods the way a sailor knows weather, by subtle shifts in light and pressure long before the storm arrives. He knew when to be invisible. He had spent years perfecting the art of it. There was a gentleness to him that never quite disappeared, no matter what the following years put him through. His 4th-grade teacher, he had a new one by that point. The family had switched schools after an incident Sandra described as a violent outburst that no other adult had witnessed. His 4th-grade teacher wrote in a report card, "Marcus is thoughtful and kind. He seems older than his years. He is sometimes withdrawn, but I have never seen him be unkind to any other student." Sandra crossed out the word kind and wrote something in the margin. The teacher never found out what. But here is what's important to understand about Marcus at 9, 10, 11 years old. He was not broken. He was watchful. He was quiet. He was carrying something heavy that he didn't have words for yet. But he was not what they said he was. Not even close. The first prescription came in January of 1996. Marcus was 9.5. It was a low dose of an antipsychotic medication that Dr. Ferris had prescribed after 2 sessions, and extensive intake information provided almost entirely by Sandra. Marcus himself had sat in that office and answered questions carefully and honestly. He said he felt fine most of the time, that he was a little sad sometimes, that he had bad dreams occasionally. Normal things, in other words, for a child of a broken home in a small town in the mid-90s. But Sandra's account was different. And Sandra's written notes were detailed and specific and went back months. And so the prescription was written. Marcus took the medication for 3 weeks before he told his mother it was making him feel foggy. Sandra told him that was normal. He took it for another 2 weeks and told her he felt worse. Sandra increased his dosage, not on any doctor's advice, but on her own, quietly, without telling anyone. She told Dr. Ferris at the next appointment that the medication wasn't working. Dr. Ferris adjusted the prescription. This cycle, symptom, medication, quiet tampering, escalation, would continue for years. But Marcus didn't know that yet. He was 9 years old. He trusted the adults. What Marcus did have, quietly and without anyone to guide it, was a mind that refused to fully accept the narrative being constructed around him. He couldn't have explained it then. He didn't have the vocabulary or the framework. But somewhere in the back of that watchful, cataloging brain, things weren't adding up. He noticed, for instance, that his episodes always seemed to happen when no one else was present except his mother. He noticed that he always felt significantly worse on days when his mother had been especially attentive, bringing him special drinks, insisting he rest, keeping him home from school. He noticed that when he stayed with his grandmother for 2 weeks in the summer of 1997, his mother's mother, Evelyn, a sharp and kind woman who lived in Kentucky, he felt completely fine. Clear-headed, energetic, normal. And that within 3 days of returning home, the fog would settle back in. He noticed these things the way you notice something in your peripheral vision, not directly, not with full comprehension, but persistently.
You keep seeing it. You don't know what it is yet.
His grandmother, Evelyn, noticed things too. She mentioned once, carefully, to Sandra that Marcus seemed different at her house. Sandra said that was because Millbridge was stressful for him. She said the change in environment helped temporarily, but wasn't a solution. She said she was managing it. Evelyn looked at Marcus over Sandra's shoulder as Sandra said this. Marcus looked back at her. Neither of them had words for what was happening yet. In 2001, Marcus was 15. He had been on and off 3 different medications, had been seen by 4 psychiatrists over 6 years, had missed entire semesters of school due to what his medical file described as acute psychological episodes, and had been briefly hospitalized twice, once at age 11, once at age 13. Both hospitalizations had been initiated by Sandra, who had brought him to the emergency room in a state of what she described as acute distress. In both cases, the attending staff had noted that the patient seemed calm and oriented on arrival, but had deferred to the parent's account. By 15, Marcus had read enough of his own medical file, fragments, waiting rooms, glimpsing things he wasn't supposed to see, to know that the words used to describe him felt wrong. Not in a delusional way. In the specific, quiet way of someone who knows what a room looks like from inside it. He started keeping a journal. He kept it hidden in the spine of a loose baseboard in his bedroom. He wrote down dates. He wrote down what he ate and drank, and when he felt worse. He wrote down his mother's behavior in the hours before he felt sick. He didn't know what he was documenting. But some part of him, the same part that had been watching and cataloging since he was 5 years old, knew that documentation mattered. He just didn't know yet how much. By the time Marcus was 17, the architecture of his life had been almost entirely constructed around illness. He had no close friends. The combination of missed school, social stigma, and the constant low-grade sedation of rotating medications had made friendship logistically and emotionally impossible. He had dropped off the track team in 9th grade when Sandra told his coach that Marcus had a condition that made competitive stress dangerous. He had stopped drawing. He'd been gifted at it. His elementary school teachers had noticed it early, because somewhere between the prescriptions and the hospitalizations and the fog, the impulse had simply dried up. His world was very small. It was Willowbrook Drive. It was his mother's schedule. It was the inside of waiting rooms in medical offices across 3 counties, because Sandra was thorough about second opinions, as long as those second opinions were being sought from doctors who had already been primed with her version of events. And here is where it becomes important to understand the specific nature of what Sandra was doing, because it was not simple and it was not careless. What Sandra Webb was doing had a clinical name that wouldn't be applied to her for another 8 years, and that name is factitious disorder imposed on another, more commonly known by its older name, Munchausen syndrome by proxy. It is a form of abuse that is almost uniquely difficult to detect because it presents, from the outside, as extraordinary parental devotion. The abuser is not neglectful. They are present. They are attentive. They take detailed notes. They research diagnoses. They advocate loudly and emotionally for their child. The child is not bruised. The child is, in fact, very well cared for in every external sense, well-dressed, well-fed, kept clean and warm. What the child is not is healthy, because the illness, in many cases, is being manufactured. In Marcus's case, the precise mechanism took years to establish. But what investigators would eventually determine was this. Sandra had been administering small amounts of medications not prescribed to Marcus, sedatives, primarily, in doses carefully calibrated to produce symptoms of cognitive impairment and agitation without triggering anything acute enough to cause a full medical investigation. She had been doing this consistently for years. The fog Marcus experienced at home, the clarity he experienced at his grandmother's, the pattern he had been quietly documenting in his journal since he was 15. It was not imagined. It was not his broken mind. It was chemistry. It was deliberate. And it had been happening since he was somewhere between 8 and 9 years old. But here is the cruelest part of the whole mechanism, because Marcus had been told for years that he had a mental illness, and because he had internalized enough of that narrative to doubt his own perceptions, he had never been fully able to trust what he was observing. Every time the thought surfaced, something isn't right here. This isn't coming from inside me. Sandra was there with a gentle, sorrowful correction. Sweetheart, that's the disorder talking. That's why you need the medication. That's why we have to be careful. Gaslighting doesn't require cruelty. It requires consistency. And Sandra Webb was, above all things, consistent. The real problem, in other words, wasn't that Marcus was mentally ill. The real problem was that he had been so thoroughly trained to believe he had become, in some ways, a co-architect of his own captivity. And that was exactly where Sandra needed him to stay. Marcus turned 18 in October of 2004 and moved out of Willowbrook Drive within 3 weeks of his birthday. He didn't have a plan. He had a duffel bag, $340 in cash saved from occasional yard work for neighbors, and his hidden journal, 11 notebooks by now, spanning 9 years, filled with dates and observations and the careful, methodical record-keeping of a person who knew, without knowing why, that the truth was somewhere in the accumulation of small details. He moved into a room in a boarding house in Columbus. He got a job at a hardware store. He stopped taking all medication, cold turkey, which was dangerous and which he should not have done without medical supervision, but which he did anyway because stopping felt less like a risk and more like a necessary experiment. Within 6 weeks, the fog lifted. Not metaphorically. Literally. He described it later as walking out of a building that had no windows into open air for the first time. Colors were sharper. His memory improved dramatically. He could hold conversations without losing the thread. He could read a full chapter of a book without forgetting the beginning by the time he reached the end. He could feel things, not the blunted, medicated approximations of feelings he had lived with since childhood, but actual emotions, with full range and resolution. He was 18 years old, and he was, for the first time in his conscious memory, experiencing his own unmedicated, unmanipulated mind. And it worked. It worked fine. But what he noticed next changed everything. Going back through the earliest notebooks, the ones from 2001, 2002, he began to see a pattern he hadn't been old enough or clear-headed enough to fully articulate at the time. The pattern was this. His worst periods had not correlated with stress, or school, or emotional events. They had correlated with his mother's proximity and with specific beverages she prepared for him, herbal teas, primarily, which Sandra had always framed as part of a natural support protocol she had developed alongside his medication regimen. He sat with that observation for a long time. Then he went to a library and spent 3 hours reading. He didn't know the clinical term yet. But he found enough articles about medical abuse, about parents who fabricated illness in children, about the documented use of sedating substances, to understand at 18 years old, sitting in a public library in Columbus, Ohio, that what he had been experiencing for most of his childhood was not the disorder his mother had described. It was the disorder his mother had. He didn't cry. He went very still. He closed the books. He walked back to the boarding house and sat on his bed and looked at the wall for a long time. Then he picked up his journal and started a new page. What Marcus Webb did next is the part of the story that most people would not have had the patience or the discipline to do. And it matters, because it's the reason that what eventually happened was not just a personal reckoning but a documented, undeniable, permanent record. He did not call the police. He did not confront his mother. He did not post about it online or tell his coworkers or write a letter to any of the doctors. He did none of the things that an 18-year-old who had just understood the shape of his own abuse might understandably have done. What he did was plan. He worked at the hardware store from 7 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. He took a second job, evenings at a grocery warehouse, from 4 until 10. He saved money with a discipline that people who knew him found almost uncomfortable to observe. Within 8 months, he had $2,800 in a savings account. He enrolled in a community college course in the evenings, Introduction to Psychology. Not for a credential, for a framework. He needed language for what he was trying to understand. In the spring of 2005, he drove back to Millbridge for the first time since leaving. Not to see Sandra. He parked 2 streets over from Willowbrook Drive and walked to the office of Dr. Alan Morse, his childhood pediatrician. Dr. Morse had retired the previous year, but his practice had been taken over by a younger physician, and the staff, who remembered Marcus. He asked, politely and calmly, for a copy of his own medical records.
He was 18.
He was legally entitled to them. The receptionist hesitated, called someone in the back, and then printed them, 312 pages spanning birth to age 15, which was when the practice had transferred his file to the psychiatric specialists in Columbus. He sat in his car and read them for 4 hours. What he found was not a single smoking gun. It was more subtle than that, and in some ways more damning. It was a pattern of language. Sandra's reported observations dominated every file entry. Her descriptions of Marcus's behavior were vivid, specific, and emotionally charged in ways that the clinical observations made during the actual appointments were not. In appointment after appointment, the attending physician's own notes described a child who appeared calm, oriented, and age-appropriate, followed by a paragraph of Sandra's account of what happened at home, which was almost unrecognizable from the same child. And yet, consistently, the prescriptions were based on Sandra's account, not on what the doctors observed.
On what Sandra said.
Marcus photographed every page with a disposable camera. He drove to a pharmacy and had the photos developed. He mailed copies to himself and stored the originals with the photographs in a locked box at the hardware store where he worked, in a locker no one else used. Then he kept going. In 2006, he tracked down the records from the 2 hospitalizations. These required more effort, a formal records request, a waiting period, a fee. He paid the fee. He waited. When the records arrived, he read them with the same quiet attention he had brought to everything else. And that's when things took a different turn. The hospitalization records from 2000, the year Marcus was 14, included a toxicology screening. Standard procedure in pediatric psychiatric cases. The results had been filed and, apparently, never followed up on. They showed trace amounts of a benzodiazepine, a class of sedative drug, in Marcus's system. The attending physician had noted this in the file with a question mark and a note that read, possible environmental exposure, parent informed, reported no known prescription in household. Sandra had been informed, and she had said there were no sedatives in the house, and the matter had been dropped. Marcus read that line 4 times. He set the page down on his kitchen table. He got up, walked to the window, looked at the parking lot of the boarding house for a while. Then he walked back and sat down and picked up the page again. He wrote the date in his journal, February 14, 2007. He was 21 years old, and he had just found the first real crack in the wall. The next phase took 2 years, and it required a kind of methodical patience that Marcus, by this point, had spent his entire life developing. Whether he knew it or not, every year of careful observation, every hidden notebook, every hour spent learning to read rooms and people and the subtle language of what was actually happening versus what was being said, all of it had been preparation for exactly this. He enrolled in a paralegal studies program in 2007, not to become a paralegal but to understand how evidence worked, how records were authenticated, how cases were built, and what made them hold. He understood instinctively that what he had was not yet a case. It was a collection of observations and documents and a toxicology report that had been noted and ignored. For it to mean anything, it had to be assembled correctly. He began reaching out, carefully, to people from his childhood. Former teachers, including Mrs. Patton, his third-grade teacher, who was now retired and living in Cincinnati and who remembered Marcus with great warmth and who told him on the phone, carefully, that she had always found the story of his illness difficult to reconcile with the child she had known. She agreed to write a statement. He found his fourth-grade teacher. Same response. Same willingness. He reached out, in the summer of 2008, to his grandmother Evelyn. She was 73 by then, sharp as she had ever been. When Marcus told her what he was doing, carefully in pieces, not all at once, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions." Evelyn had kept things. Letters from Sandra over the years. Letters in which Sandra described Marcus's condition in terms that became more elaborate and more extreme over time. She had never shown them to anyone. She had kept them in a shoebox under her bed in Kentucky because something about them had never sat right with her and she hadn't known what to do with them. She mailed the shoebox to Marcus. He opened it on a Sunday morning in March of 2009. 14 years of letters. Sandra's voice in her own handwriting, describing a child who didn't exist, building a fiction brick by brick, year by year, in letters to his grandmother who had seen through it and said nothing because she hadn't known how to say it, because what Sandra was doing didn't have a name that ordinary people knew. Marcus sat with those letters for a long time. Then he called a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Patricia Osei. She was a Columbus-based attorney who had handled one previous case involving factitious disorder imposed on another, not a prosecution and elder care case, and she understood what she was looking at when Marcus brought her the box. The box, by March of 2019, the day Marcus sat in the parking garage, contained 11 journals spanning 1996 to 2004, 312 pages of pediatric medical records, 64 pages of psychiatric hospitalization records, including the toxicology report from 2000, 14 years of letters from Sandra to Evelyn, written statements from 4 former teachers and 2 family friends, and a document that Patricia Osei had obtained through a formal legal process that had taken 4 years and 2 court orders to complete. The complete psychiatric file from Marcus's primary treatment doctor, Dr. Helen Ferris, spanning 1995 to 2004. That file contained something that had never been visible in the fragments Marcus had been able to access before. It contained Dr. Ferris's private clinical notes, not the official type summaries, but the handwritten margin notes she made during sessions. And in those notes, beginning around 2001, there was a recurring observation that Dr. Ferris had apparently never felt confident enough to act on, but had documented nonetheless. She had written, in November of 2001, "Patient presents as unremarkable in session. All described behaviors reported exclusively by mother. No corroborating observations from school or external sources. Consider source reliability." She had written it. She had filed it. She had continued the treatment anyway. But she had written it. Combined with the toxicology report, trace benzodiazepines in a 14-year-old with no prescription in the household, filed and forgotten, and the pattern documented across hundreds of pages spanning nearly 2 decades, Patricia Osei filed a formal complaint with the Ohio State Medical Board in the spring of 2019, alongside a civil suit against Sandra Webb. The civil suit was settled out of court in November of 2019. The terms were sealed. But the medical board investigation was not sealed, and its findings, published in early 2020, were unambiguous. Sandra Webb had, according to the board's findings, consistently and deliberately provided false information to medical providers over a period of at least 16 years, resulting in unnecessary psychiatric treatment, unnecessary medication, and documented physical harm to her child. The toxicology evidence was categorized as consistent with intentional administration. The board referred the case to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. Sandra Webb was charged with felony child endangerment in March of 2020. She was 66 years old. She pled no contest in September of 2020. She was sentenced to 4 years of supervised probation, mandatory psychiatric treatment, and a formal finding of medical abuse entered into the public record. It was not enough. Marcus knew it wasn't enough. But it was real. It was documented. It was permanent. For the first time in 34 years, the official record of Marcus Webb's life told the truth. Millbridge, Ohio. A Tuesday morning in October of 2020. The story had made the local news the previous week. Not front page, it was 2020, and the world had other things on its front pages. But it was there. A short piece in the Columbus Dispatch. A longer one in the county paper that had covered the Webb family's story in fragments for decades without ever questioning Sandra's version of it. People read it the way people read things that require them to revise a story they have held for a long time. Slowly, with discomfort. Dr. Morse, retired now, 74 years old, living in Florida, was interviewed for the county paper. He said he was devastated. He said he had trusted the parents' account because that was standard practice and because Sandra had been, in his experience, an exceptionally engaged and detailed advocate for her son. He said he wished he had pushed harder when things didn't add up. He said he was sorry. Marcus, when he read the interview, felt something complicated that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite anger. Something in between. Mrs. Patton, his third-grade teacher, posted something on Facebook. She didn't name Sandra directly. She wrote about a student she had known, a quiet boy who had been extraordinarily perceptive and kind, and about how she had never believed the story that had been told about him. She wrote, "I should have said something sooner. I didn't have words for it. I'm sorry, Marcus." She tagged him. He commented a single word. "Thank you." His uncle, Sandra's brother, the man who had gently questioned her at Thanksgiving in 1995 and then backed down, called Marcus for the first time in 11 years. The call lasted 2 minutes. He said, "I should have pushed harder." Marcus said, "Yes." The uncle said he was sorry. Marcus said he knew. There was a long silence. Then Marcus said, "I'm all right," and they hung up. Sandra's neighbors on Willowbrook Drive, the same neighbors who had spoken in lowered voices about the Webb boy all those years ago, were quiet in a different way now. The house was for sale by November. Sandra had moved to be near her sister in another state. The ceramic rooster was gone from the front door. The flower boxes were empty. The people who had enabled this, not through cruelty mostly, but through deference, through the cultural reflex to trust a mother's account of her own child, through the institutional tendency to take the most convenient available narrative and stop there, those people sat with it in their own private ways. Some of them reached out to Marcus. Some of them didn't. He understood both responses. What none of them could give back was time. And Marcus knew that going in. He had never expected them to. By 2022, Marcus Webb was 36 years old. He had, by that point, completed a bachelor's degree in social work from Ohio State, begun in 2015, finished in 2020, the same year as the sentencing. He had been in therapy since 2009, working through 18 years of medical trauma, identity disruption, and the specific, layered grief of understanding that the person who had most consistently harmed you had also been, structurally, the most important person in your life. He was not bitter. He was careful about saying that in public because it tended to read as performed, the "I forgive her" narrative that people want to hear because it's tidier. He didn't frame it as forgiveness. He framed it as understanding the difference between accountability and consumption. Sandra being held accountable mattered. Marcus spending his life consumed by Sandra did not serve anyone, least of all Marcus. He had started writing publicly about his experience in 2020, initially in a private blog that he shared only with his therapist and his grandmother Evelyn. The responses, when he eventually made the writing public in 2021, were immediate and overwhelming in volume. Hundreds of messages from people, adults primarily, who had been medically abused as children and who had spent decades told they were too sensitive or too damaged to trust their own memories. People who had been gaslit so thoroughly and for so long that they had given up on the idea of being believed. He answered as many of them as he could. In 2022, in partnership with a hospital advocacy group in Columbus, Marcus helped develop a training module for pediatric medical staff, a curriculum specifically designed to teach doctors and nurses how to identify discrepancies between parental accounts and clinical observations, how to treat those discrepancies as data rather than noise, and how to create safe processes for following up on anomalies without alienating parents whose concern for their children is genuine. The Toxicology Report from 2000. The Margin Note from Dr. Ferris in 2001. Two tiny pieces of documentation that had been filed and forgotten. Marcus had spent 20 years making sure that the next child didn't have to wait 20 years. The training module was adopted by 3 hospital systems in Ohio by the end of 2022. It was under review in 2 more states, and in the fall of 2022, Marcus received a letter from a woman he didn't know. A woman in Michigan who had just turned 17. Her name was Cora. She wrote that her mother had been under investigation for factitious disorder imposed on another, and that a nurse at her hospital had flagged the discrepancy between her clinical presentation and her mother's account because the nurse had recently completed a training module on medical child abuse. Cora was writing to say, "Thank you." Marcus read the letter twice. Then he added it to the box. Evelyn Webb turned 80 years old in the summer of 2023.
She was still sharp.
She still lived in her house in Kentucky, though she had someone come in 3 days a week now to help. Marcus drove down to visit her on her birthday, and they sat on her back porch the way they had sat when he was a child, the same green wooden chairs, the same view of the same field, the same quality of summer light through the same oak tree. She asked him how the work was going. He told her about Cora. He told her about the training module expanding. He told her about a documentary filmmaker who had approached him about his story. He hadn't decided about that yet. She listened to all of it with the quiet attention she had always given him. Then she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I used to think the worst thing was that I didn't say anything. Now I think maybe the worst thing was that I didn't have words for it." She paused. "You gave it words. That matters." Marcus had thought about this a great deal. The naming of things. How much of what Sandra had been able to sustain for so long had depended on its namelessness. People had seen fragments of something wrong and had not been able to point to it directly because they didn't have a word for it. And without a word, you can't build a conversation. Without a conversation, you can't build a case. The 11 journals, his own insistence at 15 on documenting the small true details of his life when everyone around him was telling a different story about those details, that was the beginning. Not the end. The beginning. He had started talking to high school students the previous fall. Not about his mother, specifically. About documentation. About trusting your own perceptions. About the difference between a story being told about you and the truth of your own experience. About writing things down not because you know what they mean yet, but because you know they matter. The students listened. Some of them with the particular focused attention of people who recognize something they have never had words for. Marcus recognized that look. He had worn it his whole childhood. He made sure to give them the words. In the parking garage in Tucson, in March of 2019, Marcus Webb sat with 64 pages of hospital records on his passenger seat and his mother's missed call on his phone. He didn't call her back that day. Or that week. He wasn't ready for that conversation yet, and he had spent a lifetime learning, the value of not moving before you're ready. What he did do was drive to a diner, order coffee, and sit in a window booth for 2 hours reading every page of those records in the afternoon light. When he finished, he set them down carefully, aligned the pages, slid them back into the envelope. Then he looked out at the street. Here is what I want you to hold on to from Marcus's story. The truth does not require your permission to exist. It exists regardless of who is telling a story about you, regardless of how long that story has been told, regardless of how many people have heard it and believed it. The truth is patient in a way that lies can never afford to be. Because lies require maintenance, constant attention, constant reinforcement, constant management of who knows what. Truth just waits. Marcus had 11 journals because at 15, he trusted something inside himself more than he trusted the story being told around him. He didn't know what that trust would build. He just kept writing. That is the whole lesson. That is all of it. When everything external has been taken from you, your health, your credibility, your history, your own name, there is one thing that cannot be touched if you are careful about protecting it. Your record of what is actually true. Keep the record. Even when no one believes it. Even when you can barely believe it yourself. The parking garage. The envelope. The 64 pages. Marcus Webb had been keeping that record for 20 years. And it held.